This is the Change Physician, episode 126.
Hey, folks, welcome back to the Change Physician podcast. This is Dr. Kevin Cuccaro with my Amazeballs co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady. How are you doing, Melissa?
I'm great. I'm just laughing about our subsequent episode.
I know. For those of you who wonder why we were originally going to record this, and then we got sidetracked on a big discussion on the this is versus I am doctor, which is a whole nother episode, which will come after this one at 127. But yeah, interesting how that conversation flew out. So let's try this again. This is the episode that we originally were going to talk about. And what we wanted to talk, this episode is about default behavior. And the way this came out of is we just did the episode on why change is hard. And we talked about these terms like cognitive dissonance and beliefs and behaviors, and how your beliefs will tend to be revised to fit your behavior rather than vice versa. Not always, but then rather than vice versa. And then we had this conversation led predominantly by you, which led to this one is when it comes to a physician, and you were given a specific example of someone that you recently met. And this idea that when we are under distress is how we typically revert to a specific set of behavior. And so would you mind kind of talking a little bit about that background so everybody knows what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I'll put it in context. So spoke with a physician colleague and just talking about life and work and realized that there's a lot of things that we like to improve on our whole personal development aspect of our life. And we just discussed how despite the effort to be in the moment and to really enjoy life outside of work, sometimes when things change at work or things happen in life that create additional stress, or there's some type of transition or change, it creates a patterning, or I would say we called it at the time during our conversation a default behavior. And for many physicians, we're used to working. We can work really, really hard because it was required. It was required for survival. You couldn't get through all the training and everything that we've done without being an incredibly hard worker with an amazing work ethic, and committed to our patients and wanting to do a good job. And this other thing I didn't mention is just, you always feel like you don't know enough. And it's like, even though people on the outside look at you and they're like, oh, you're so successful, you made it, and da da da. It's like, no, people, we still feel like we're in this process. Like, it's just, we're not at that place that everyone thinks that we're at, and that everything is fully fulfilled. So yeah, that's kind of where the conversation happened. And for many of us, just being busy is our default. And when I brought this up with you, you talked about there's a lot of things that, and I'll give some other examples, not necessarily relating to you, but some people that had a bad smoking habit, they go back to it. They've already put those wirings in their brain. That's how when they have those feelings of discomfort and stress, they reach for it. Food, it's another one. Gambling, shopping. There's all these, some people travel, but it usually has to be kind of planned most of the time. But or maybe lashing out. There's these, people get stressed. They almost seem like they're like a second person, like they can't cope. So all these like coping mechanisms, kind of these default patterns or behaviors, are things that I think the reason we're bringing it up today is that when change is hard, be aware that whatever patterning you've run before, it's vulnerable to getting restarted, or you might fall back to it. And so sometimes, we could talk about how, you kind of set yourself up for success. If you're aware of these things, maybe start creating these other coping mechanisms that you can fall into instead of your maybe, ironically, sometimes the default is counterproductive to the changes you want to make personally in your own life. So I guess I'll turn it over to you to talk about kind of maybe some of the things you might do, or your default, or what you think about what I said.
Well, my defaults become difficult to kind of personally identify, but I want to explore a little bit on that, because I think default is a great word. The other way you can think about it is habit, your habitual behaviors, what it is that you doesn't require a lot of conscious engagement with, right? And the importance of this is because this really is moving into the stress literature. Like when you start looking at organisms under stress, they default to the known behaviors because they don't have the capacity to start thinking in that wide string, right? So if you are under distress, what happens? Your perception focus shifts down, it narrows down. You start thinking in terms of immediate action. What do I need to do next to survive? And we don't have tigers necessarily running around anymore, but our brains have evolved in this way, just kind of see threat versus non-threat. And when we're under high degrees of threat, that threat can be lack of sleep, can be too many patients, it can be hostile work environments, it could just be simply, a lot of debt, perception of I have $600,000 of debt, and having all that going on top of you, it's going to narrow your focus down.
Mm-hmm.
And then you will be going back to those default behaviors, those habitual roles, the ones that you have done because they don't require you to think much.
Yeah.
They may actually be more physically demanding. They may actually be counterproductive in the long term, but because they don't demand those cognitive resources in the short term, you will fall back on them.
Yeah.
And, and as a physician, I just wish people were, again, a little bit more aware of this. And I wish that had been incorporated in our training a little bit better, because this can be a good thing, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that we have long training patterns, the reason that a surgeon does however many operations that they do, why an anesthesiologist does however many laryngoscopies that we do, and we can do it as the default, is because then when we are under high distress, when stuff's really hitting the fan, you can default to those behaviors and perform them because you have practiced so hard and long.
Yep.
Now, when we're trying to do intentional change, though, like when we talked about in the prior episode about why change is hard, when you're looking at this balance between your beliefs and behaviors, what you then need to do is make sure that you recognize that your environment is going to influence those behaviors, which are going to influence those or to reinforce those beliefs. So if you're trying to do intentional change, you need to recognize the influence of the environment on that and start setting things up in advance. It is very, very difficult to do intentional change when you're under high distress in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
So then you have to do preparatory change. It's super fascinating to me. We look at when you were successful people, and I don't know what the metric is on that. Maybe they are wealthy, maybe they're doing things, maybe they're influencers or whatever. And there's this idea that they somehow have all this extra willpower, like, oh, they just have better willpower than me. They don't, they're skinny, or they're ripped because that's their genes, or they're a super person and they're doing all that stuff. But what they've done on the studies, when they've looked at people who have achieved the results that a lot of us, we're looking at height, weight, activity, whatever, the difference is not that they have more willpower, it's that they've chosen to exercise that cognitive control earlier. They know in this environment, that's going to be hurtful to me. I'm a person who has a history of alcoholism. I know that the bar is where I'm going to be most likely to regress into that type of behavior. Therefore, I'm going to decide now not to go to the bar. And so you look at implementation intentions. That's oh God, I forgot her name and her husband. Goal. There's two of them, and it really, really interesting stuff about this whole thing about when you're looking at mental contrasting and implementation intentions. What you're doing is you're kind of pre-deciding something before you are in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
What you've done is you're making the decision now on that intentional action, so that when you are in that high distress environment, you are less likely to fall into the previous default behavior.
Yep.
And it, again, super, super, super key, because that whatever we're doing on a day-to-day basis, whatever we've been doing for the last past 10 to 20 or 30 years, that is what we're going to default in anytime we are under high distress, unless there is some crazy thing, someone pushing us out of the way, someone who's more influenced than those habitual patterns in the brain are. And if you're struggling with change, the thing to do is start making those pre-decisions and start looking at ways that you can influence that environment when you're safe, when you're rested, when you're fed, so that then you can be prepared when you're entering those distressful spaces.
Yeah, and there was a couple of books I read about basically linking even the thought of what you would do in these circumstances, or even like when you think about athletes, like if they encountered this kind of obstacle, what they would do. A lot of this, I can't think of the right word, where they're just kind of running through it in their mind. But the other, are you going to say something?
Well, yeah, that's we call that imagination, but it's not imagination,
There's
but
another word.
it's visualization.
Visualization.
Visualization, right? And
Yes.
people and there's a lot of actually interesting data on visualization for well, I don't want to go off on
No, that's
tangents
okay.
there.
No, it makes me think about this topic that I was going to bring up. And actually, it's an example of something. Recently, I had a little IV sedation case, and I was just kind of inquiring about the necessity, and then also the safety and all of these things. Of course, this is my realm, this is my field, so I know when the things can go bad. It's rare, but you want to make sure they're prepared. So my comment is totally related to what we're talking about right now. Is I was told everyone is ACLS certified, like advanced cardiac life support certified. I'm like, well, if nothing really ever goes wrong, then A, they're not experienced. And second, we all know, and I told this to the practitioner, or the I'll say practitioner to keep it vague. I said, you and I both know that not everyone handles these moments of distress or stress very well. Some people can't, don't know what to do, and they suddenly they get tunnel vision, and then they don't know what to do, and they stall. And moments count when it comes to your airway. So when you said that there's a lot of experience that we have by repetition, or even visualization, like sometimes I'll run through visualizing a certain particular patient on knowing they have this issue, this issue, and I will mentally prepare myself that if this happened, what would I do? It's just kind of like, it's just almost like a knee-jerk reaction for me to always think like that, because we're trained to think of the worst case scenario. So I think that's something that when there's a lot of noise, or however you want to say it, a lot of distress, a lot of stress, and acute emergency, any physician out there that has been an intern has come to a scene where they have to like figure things out. If they can't zoom out, it's either they got lucky or things maybe didn't go as well as they had hoped. It's a very that's why it's essential, especially under those like life and death situations, that you practice and you process the thinking and the decision making. Granted, many things in life aren't necessarily that quite life and death, but it's not, to me, it's not that much different. It's just on a different level of responsibility. So,
but you just made me think of an acronym for this, and maybe someone already has an acronym, but like, actually, I was like, well, there's three things. I like threes.
Yeah.
Right. So this whole thing about intentional change and default behavior, there's three things that you can really focus on. There's prepare, which means you have to be aware that there's going to be an influence on your behavior based on the environment and the specific scenario. So once you know that, you can visualize those scenarios and then try to then influence, well, if I am in this situation, then I'm going to do that. So we're mental contrasting. We're actually seeing the event. Then we're, looking at what the potential scenarios are, worst case, best case. We're identifying the best case. Then we're saying, if I'm in this scenario, this is the choice I'm going to make. So that's the implementation intention. That's prepare. The other one is practice. So the next thing you can do is practice. That visualization exercise is practicing if in every scenario that you're going into, and again, as physicians, we tend to do this. I'm sure surgeons do some sort of visualization. I think that's in their training when you're visualizing actually doing the surgery. Anesthesia, we tend to visualize. I'm not sure the other cognitive specialties probably need to, but maybe they don't think about it. But you can prepare by visualization. Like I say, prepare and practice by visualization. If you're in those, you can practice the same behaviors. So when you're not in those threatening, maybe you want to start doing a exercise pattern, you can start practicing the movements. And then the last one is the pause. And that pause is if you are now in that moment where things are overwhelming, the first thing that you need to do is get your sympathetic overdrive down. Like one of my favorite sayings, and I don't know if you ever learned this, but this is like an anesthesia thing, is in a crisis situation, the first person's pulse to take is your own. And I love that saying, right? Because what that means is the first person that you need to start being aware of is you.
Yeah.
And it was even expanded then is like basically stop and take your own pulse.
Yeah.
Well, that creates a pause. Like if you're in this thing and there's a crisis and and crap is going and there's blood flying everywhere and beeper things and, the little beep, 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 which if you're not an anesthesiologist, that's like the most terrifying sound in the world.
Yes.
Oh my God. And then
Yeah.
especially when it starts going boo, boo down.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But then pause, take a couple, slow, deep breaths. 3 to 6. People think, well, that's a big deal. Well, no, 3 to 6 deep breaths, or 3 deep breaths where you're taking about 5 to 10 seconds there.
Mhm.
That little preparatory action is going to allow you to think a little bit more clear.
Mhm.
And maybe, you think about crisis, but anytime, if you're trying to actually change your practice style, if you're trying to maybe create some more awareness, maybe you're trying to start building some intentional activities so that you're finding joy in medicine again. If you remember those 3 things, practice or preparation, practice, and pause, when you're in those scenarios at work and you're returning to that environment again, you're going to start building that space bigger, that you can have aware and intentional behavior in. And then also prepare yourself that when those crises occur, which they will, and they will always occur, you'll be ready to make the right decision that you actually want and do that intentionally rather than falling to those default behaviors and working unintentionally again.
Yeah. So it's the PPP, not necessarily the forgiveness loan that was out there during the
exactly.
P cubed.
The P cubed. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to kind of tie it all together. If you are aware, first of all, what it is that you're trying to change, and you need to, like, all the steps that you just go back and rewind what he just said, but you need to be aware of what it is you want to change, and then go through that process in order to, because life is messy. Sometimes things don't go smoothly. There's hiccups in life where it's just there's a stress here or there, and you have to be aware of how it's impacting you, and put yourself in a position to be more successful. And occasionally we might take 2 steps back, but you can always get back on the wagon, so to speak, and move forward with changes. It's just that process of wiring yourself for success takes some time and patience. So I guess I will take us out unless you have anything else to say.
Take us out.
Okay.
Dr. Katie.
Well, I am Melissa Katie, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. You'll know what I mean by that on the next episode. And we are part of the Change Physician community, the founders of the Change Physician community. If you don't know anything about that, because you just ran across this video, you can go to thechangephysician.com, whether you're a physician or a physician ally, and we'd love to see you there. Otherwise, find us on the podcast venues that are all around us, and the Ethernet, internet.
What's the difference between Ethernet and internet? That's it.
We'll have to, discover that.
Yeah.
I know there's an Ethernet cable which goes directly into them. Anyway, that's not part of our closings, but we will just go ahead and say we'd love to see any comments or likes, or just hit us up on Facebook, Instagram, or any of the other venues, and we will see you on the next episode. Take care.
Stay well, folks.